Good evening. I'm Stuart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. It is so great to be back with old friends and old friends coming to the stage. A while back, one of our speakers, Jim Glick of Chaos and all that, did a book called Time Travel. It was a book about time travel. And he made the point that it doesn't ever work. It doesn't happen. But that doesn't matter because thinking about it and talking about it and telling stories about it is one of the ways that we think about time and history and such things. And science fiction writers like Neal Stephenson are professional time travelers. Some of them do only the future. Certain kinds of such writers do only the past. And the engineering mentality of Neal Stephenson, he likes to take both to the future and, as I gather with the current book, Polostan, to the past. We're also having on the stage Charles C. Mann, who wrote the book 1491, and then the later book 1493, and then he stopped. Wrote many other books, like The Wizard and the Prophet and so on. But he's a great student of how the world changes with things like Europeans showing up suddenly on the east coast of the Americas, and how that contrasted with the gradual arrival of Asians on the west coast over previous millennia. So they are not put together accidentally on this stage. They travel together a lot. They travel to exotic places. And with any luck, we may hear some of the stories from Neal Stephenson and Charles C. Mann, and I hope you're backstage.
So I should say that a couple hours ago, I decided to walk from the hotel here, and I wasn't quite sure if I remembered the name of the venue right. And so I Googled the name, my name and Neal's name to see where we were talking. And Google very helpfully gave me an AI overview of tonight. And it said, journalist and author Charles C. Mann and author Neal Stephenson have been involved in multiple events together, which made it sound like a kind of a comedy duo. But my favorite one is the first one was the Long Now talk, this talk. And it says, in January 2018, Mann interviewed Stephenson at the Long Now Foundation about Stephenson's book, Polostan. And so I first had two thoughts. I guess I had two thoughts. The first was that my wife is accurately, constantly accusing me of being late. But 6 years is something of a record. And the second is that, speaking of travel, I think it was in 2017, in other words, just a few months before this talk in 2018, that Neal and I were in Utah, and Neal expressed a desire to ride a horse, which surprised me a bit. And I said, why? And you said, you had this idea for a novel in your head, and that horses in the West and so forth were involved. And amazingly, this novel's now out 4 months later. And but I also wanted to know, you've obviously had this idea for a really long time. What does it mean that you have a novel in your head for a really long time, particularly a cycle of novels of uncertain length?
Yeah, this one actually started in 2013. When I heard from my friend Seamus Blackley, who is a physicist who was the father of the Xbox and has done a lot of other interesting things in his career, but he had become aware of a particular story dating to the early, the years prior to the beginning of the Manhattan Project. That was a really interesting story, both on a physics level and on a kind of human drama level. And so ever since then, we've been kind of kept in touch on this topic. And so I've been kind of developing this idea for that long, and kind of talked my publisher into published the book that long ago. But then one thing after another kept kept happening. And I said, well, okay, I'm still working on the bomb light series, but I do have this other idea that I think I could write quicker. So how about if I just do that, and then we'll get that out, and then I can turn my attention back to Bomb Light. And Bomb Light is the overall name of this series of books. So that was Seven Eves. And then I turned back to this, and I did some more work on it. And then the same thing happened with two other books, The Rise and Fall of Dodo, and, three other books. Fall or Dodge in Hell and Termination Shock. And finally, after Termination Shock, they were like, we signed a contract 10 years ago for you to write these books. You have to write these books. So I did. So I went back to the notes that I had started back in 2013 and started organizing them and pulled them together into the first volume. I've got more stuff that's going to go into a second volume. But sometimes this style of writing books actually works out pretty well if you let something percolate for a long time. So the idea for Seven Eves came to me in 2004, and I would go and poke at it from time to time and write bits of it. But I didn't actually write it for it. I think it came out in 2017. And some parts of Reamd were also kind of percolating for that long. So I think it can actually lead to good results to kind of let these things simmer on a low boil for a really long time.
So I'm not going to go into everything the book is about, but say that among the subjects covered are the strategy of polo, exactly what was in the Chicago World's Fair of the early 1930s, the workings of machine gun smuggling, and Soviet steel production, a whole bunch of things like this. And as a person who writes nonfiction books, all of these to me say rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I know, and I kind of don't want to know the answer to this question, but when I do this, like I have lots and lots of beautifully worked out 3,000 word, 4,000 word excerpts that are completely irrelevant and just die on my computer hard drive. Is this the same for you?
Yeah, I'm trying to get away from that method.
To be more efficient?
Yeah.
Good luck.
So, because like you, I can identify a rabbit hole now when I see one, which takes a while to learn that skill. So for example, this book takes place during the 1930s, mostly. And so one thing that I kept bumping into unexpectedly was polo. I found it very strange that this kept coming up, and because of course to us today, polo is the ultimate sort of fancy upper crust people niche sport, but it was much more widespread then. And the reason is that they still had horse cavalry. And where you've got active horse cavalry, you've got polo, because that is the training technique that you use. So even the Soviet Red Army had a polo team, because you had to. You had to do that to maintain your abilities. So it's training for war. And so I started paying attention to that, and I then stumbled upon something that I did not see coming at all, which was that in the vicinity of Gillette, Wyoming, there were polo pony ranches that existed to breed and train these ponies for the worldwide market of people who played polo, a market that was much bigger then than it is now. And it's not enough just to breed them, you've got to actually kind of teach them to play the game a little bit, or they're useless. So the staff who worked on these ranches, who were sort of white people, cowboys, black people, Native Americans, Hispanics, they all knew how to play polo because it was part of their job. So you'd have these incredibly multi-ethnic teams of expert polo players riding around in Wyoming, training these animals how to play this upper crust sport. and fancy people from all over the world would go there on kind of vacation safaris and see what was on the market and go home with expensive horses. So so there was a rabbit hole to end all rabbit holes, and I sort of pride myself on the fact that I did not go there in this book. So
so there's not a 150-page section.
No, no, there's not. There could very easily have been, but instead it's just mentioned that this is a fact, and that one of our the main character of the book, a young woman named Dawn, had worked on one of these ranches, which explains why she knows how to play the sport, even though she's definitely not from a social class that would normally be a polo playing kinds of people.
So you guys should know that there's been a sort of a review blitz of Neal's book, and they've been extremely favorable and so forth. But one of the lines in one of the reviews really struck me, and this is in the Washington Post, and it said, "Polostan is a new departure for Stephenson." And I knew that was wrong because you've written historical novels before.
Yeah.
But it did make me wonder, do you think of historical novels as being essentially different than science fiction novels in any way?
I do not, because I've been reading science fiction since I was a kid. And I would get these big fat books, these anthologies of science fiction stories from Analog and the magazines like that. And you'd be reading along, each story is a few pages long, and suddenly you'd come to a historical story. They had sometimes they had science fictional elements, and sometimes it was just a historical story that some science fiction writer had decided to toss off. So, and it's obvious from reading a lot of science fiction that a lot of the people who write this stuff are, at least, speaking of the sort of the golden age of science fiction writers that I read when I was a kid, they're obviously history geeks. So that has been true for a really long time. And so I think in the science fiction world, there's absolutely nothing surprising or kind of eyebrow raising about a science fiction writer doing history. It just seems that way. It seems weird if you're living outside of the science fiction world and you see somebody doing it.
So, you're world building, right? You're building a 1930s America. It's a fantasy creation in a certain way, in the same way as a future society. But I am curious about what are the rules, that in your head when you're doing this. People like Hilary Mantel would claim that every action they did, and it's only their thoughts that I'm imagining. Other people feel it's okay to mess around with chronology for the sake of story. You see what I mean?
Yeah. To the greatest extent possible, if you actually put these people where they were, doing the things that they're known to have done, and then sort of weave around that's kind of the best way to approach this thing. And then because you're creating fictional characters, you can have them do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't reduce the amount of leeway that you have significantly to stick to the historical record. And occasionally, maybe some situation will arise where, oh man, it would really be cool, or it would really solve a problem for me if I have this historical character, do something that's not real. So that's kind of the approach that I take. I wouldn't say I stick to any one rule set in a totally rigorous way.
And similarly, is it important to you to go to these places, to travel around? You and I have been to a couple of places, but I don't know whether that's just coincidence or.
I used to do more of that, and what I kind of learned is similar to the rabbit hole conversation, is that in 24 hours in a new place, it's possible to absorb a book's worth of research, and then having done that, you feel like it's all got to go into the book, which isn't always. It's not always in the service of good storytelling. And so the thing is that particularly, so like in Reamdy, we were in Shaman together, and which is where a lot of that book was set, but it was a contemporary book, and so it was really valuable to go there because everything I saw was something I could use. In the case of a historical novel, the farther back in history it is, the more things have changed to the point where things might be just unrecognizable. And you have to go hunting around for the weird little museum or the historical site to get a sense of what it looked like a long time ago. So it just depends on the project and how far back in history it was. And I find that what's better is to find first-person accounts that were written back in the day. You can still go somewhere and get a sense of how things are laid out, but for example, in this case, part of the action takes place in a place called Magnitogorsk, which is a giant Soviet steel mill in the Urals. And there was an American engineer who went there in exactly this time period to work on this project, and just wrote a very concrete, simple, day-to-day account of what he saw there. There's no abstractions, there's no ideology or politics. It's just, we had to go find a wrench, it was very cold today, or what have you. And those kinds of impressions, I think, are really a lot better than just going there today and trying to imagine what it looked like before everything changed.
When they asked me to give this talk, I got out my stack of Neal books, and I thought, gee, maybe I could say something sort of profound about them. I obviously can't, but given the last story, but I did notice something that, there's this thing that if you are a writer, you encounter at various times books and lectures about how you should write a novel.
Yeah.
Right, and they're sort of based on the idea of, like the well-made play. There's a well-made novel that comes from the 19th century, I think. And then I was looking at your books, and this is, and so you have, and these things are like, there's this arc. I realize this is sounding like I've hauled you here to insult you, but I'm not actually.
No, it's okay.
But in Seven Eves, there's this great moment where you turn the page and it says 5,000 years later, which is surely the first time this has been done in literature. And I have to say, when I read that, it threw me right out of the book, and I had a picture of you kind of rubbing your hands in glee at the at the curve you had just thrown the reader. And then, Reamdy's a 700-page chase scene, right? Fall is like a book that says, hey, I'm a sort of semi-realistic satire that's going to morph into Paradise Lost and the Greek. So it's pretty clear to me that you aren't really interested in writing, well-made plays, but you're interested in thinking about, doing different stuff. And I kind of wanted to ask you about that. Is this something that's looms large in your mind, or you just sort of, I have these ideas, and the structure of the book will be whatever it is to contain it?
There's kind of a straight and narrow path that leads to being a writer that I did not go down, and it kind of starts with in a lot of places you're told, well, if you want to be a writer, you start by writing short things and work your way up to long things, which sounds incredibly reasonable. And so, start by keeping a journal, and then you can maybe write a short story one day, and so on and so forth. And I tried that and became very discouraged for a while because I couldn't write short things. And so I thought, well, okay, this is never going to work. And then one day when I was in college in Boston, I was in this horrific slum apartment where we would hunt cockroaches with vacuum cleaners. And it was spring break, so there was like 10 days. I didn't have enough money to go home, so I was just going to be stuck in this apartment for 10 days. I had nothing to do, but I had a typewriter and some paper, and so I sat down and I wrote a novel. which I didn't. It just kind of happened, and
Involuntarily?
well, I mean, I just started, and I had nothing else to do, and out it came, and so then I twigged to the fact that even though I can't write short stories, I can write novels. So that was one way in which I sort of evaded the usual, trajectory that's laid out for aspiring writers. And then there's kind of a similar thing in science fiction where there's a ladder of sorts that is put in place kind of by helpful people to help encourage people to become writers. And kind of the way it works is, you go to conventions, cons, you volunteer at conventions, you write some short pieces that get published in fan fiction or whatever. As I was saying before, you kind of climb the ladder over time. You make all these connections in that world, and you one day, if all goes well, you finally publish your first novel. I kind of ended up bypassing all of that, not because I have any problem with it, but basically I published my first two books, The Big U and Zodiac, were not really science fiction, but then Snow Crash was. And so suddenly it kind of appeared out of nowhere from the point of view of people in the science fiction world, because I hadn't climbed that ladder. And I think the vast majority of those people thought that was entirely cool. And then there were some who kind of were a little miffed. These kind of systematic approaches to how you become a writer were things that just for contingent reasons I bypassed. And so a lot of what has happened to me has happened kind of through some very, very fortunate accidents. And the other writers who've had the biggest impacts on me have been the ones who did stuff I didn't realize you were allowed to do. When Gibson wrote Neuromancer, there's a science fiction book that was absolutely science fiction. There's no question that that's a science fiction book, but it was written with kind of literary grade prose. Mm-hmm. And that was new to me. Mm-hmm. Some other people must have done it, but it was new to me, and it blew my mind, that you were allowed to do this. And I've had similar reactions to the late David Foster Wallace, to Thomas Pynchon, and some others. So it's that sense of going outside the established, what are perceived as the established limits of the art form, and getting away with things that to me was most energizing when I was getting a start.
Sarah has a extremely light and almost trivial question.
Sarah, he's saying that in a really nice way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a student of humanity and the eternal flow of chaos and order, do you think that humans will be able to avert some of the worst outcomes of our current predicaments? And the S is in predicaments is got it.
Oh man.
I was trying to warn you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I didn't catch the sarcasm in your voice.
Sarah, this is a great question. I mean, it's obviously the most important question, so I'm really not giving you grief.
I don't know. I mean, to me, the two biggies are carbon and the fact that we can't agree on what's real. And I don't know what to do about the fact that we can't agree on what's real. It's hard to think of a technical fix for that one. I think that there's technical fixes for carbon, and that those fixes are going to be implemented. I was here for termination shock a few years ago, and I said that it was going to be the biggest engineering project in history, and I still see that. I've seen it a lot since then that confirms in my mind that lots of people are now devoting their time and energy to these things. We're clearly in dark times politically, and I guess ask me in a month.
So, John asks, given generative AI, do you feel the, quote, book in the Diamond Age is becoming possible now or soon?
So
Maybe we should explain what that is for people who haven't read it.
it's a smart book that teaches kids and it changes its content dynamically according to what the kid needs. So it's an interesting question right now because with generative AI, you could ask for a little lesson every day for a kid and say, okay, teach this kid the multiplication tables using an approach, a pedagogical approach that would work for them. So in a sense, that can be done right now. I think what's missing is stringing it together with a story. It's that plus kind of the human element. So one of the themes in the Diamond Age is that there is not just the book, the content of the book, but there's also a human connection between the girl who owns the book and a so-called ractor, a performer who is sort of playing the roles of the different characters in the book, and that somehow makes a difference. It's the combination of that human connection with a plot that actually pulls the story forward, makes the kid want to learn, as opposed to just being a disorganized set of lessons. So I think those are the areas where progress is going to have to be made to do a primer.
You have something a little bit like that in Fall, where you have, there's so much garbage on the internet that people hire kind of guides. I forget what you call them.
Just editors, yeah.
Yeah. And you don't interact so much with the net yourself.
Yeah, you're reading the feed produced by that editor. Yeah.
Right. And so in this way, AI, which generates the nonsense, generates also an entire class of employment for people, for all the people that it throws out of work.
Yeah, well, I mean, that thing you read at the beginning at the top of the hour,
Yeah.
That's now in the historical record.
Right.
Right, so right now as we speak, AIs are training themselves on the knowledge that you and I talked about Polostan in 2018.
Right.
Right, so...
Enric, I think, says several years ago you talked about an initiative for positive science fiction at a bookstore. I think you had talked at the bookstore for positive science fiction. Has anything happened with that, or any plans still?
Well, we published a book called Hieroglyph. That was an initiative through Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination. And so we did assemble an anthology of stories by asking a bunch of science fiction writers to write something in that vein and pulling them together. And my contribution you can now get in a little skinny book called Atmosphere Incognita. It's about a tall tower. So that did happen. I don't think a lot more has happened. I mean, we found it curiously difficult to get science fiction writers to be happy. So in a way, it was almost a negative result in that it was just really hard to get people out of the dystopian groove. But I haven't done further work on it.
You mentioned in one of your essays that that there's sort of economic reasons that are part of the reasons that films go that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is the same thing true in the sort of science fiction
No,
writing?
I don't think so. So in movies, it's easier to make shitty-looking futures than nice-looking futures. Because if you want to make a shitty looking future, you just take what we have now and throw dirt on it, set fire to it, put graffiti on everything.
I mean, this is literally, it's not an exaggeration, it's literally what you see, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because that's so cheap and easy, it creates an economic incentive to portray those dystopias on TV. I don't think that's really as true of written science fiction, but I think, although there are dystopian novels, that in general it's a much more varied picture than in literature than it is on the screen.
No, this is an anonymous question. Is there a time you feel nostalgia for but haven't actually lived?
Man, I think I'm in the camp of people who think things were really shitty until recently. So I mean, there might be a few situations I'd want to go back to briefly, but there's places I'm curious about, but I wouldn't say I'm nostalgic about anything.
So you don't want to be in a place pre-antibiotics?
No way.
Yeah. I mean, you know that Max Roser's outfit in Oxford, the World in Data? Oh, it's a thing that collects sort of all kinds of data about the human condition and maps them out over time. And one of the more striking things you can see is maternal mortality.
Oh man.
Yeah, and just it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
And, childhood death, all those things, and they just fall off a cliff in a good way.
Yeah, that combined with no birth control.
Yeah.
So
that pushes it right up to the 60s. Yeah.
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 Right. So you're a woman in that kind of society. You know that unless you take extreme measures to isolate yourself, you will end up getting pregnant, and you know that there's a really high chance that you're going to die.
And so one of the things that's really quite interesting actually about Polostan is you have a young woman, and she's kind of acutely conscious of sort of the way that the men around her are looking at her in a time when rules against sexual assault are pretty vague, I guess, and the consequences for her are incredibly negative. I mean, this.
Well, she knows that she's had an early relationship with an older woman named Veronica, who is a Russian woman who is a soldier in one of the women's death battalions. This is another one of these can't make it up things, but the women's death battalions were these sort of incredibly hardcore female warriors I think initially they were in the cause of Kerensky, but some of them went over to the Bolsheviks. So they were like this elite squad of like Soviet warrior Amazons. And there's also another sort of trope in Soviet culture at the time, which is the woman machine gunner. Mm-hmm. So machine guns are a comparatively new weapon, and in the doctrine of the time, the Soviets did have really strong and sincere feminist ideas. Okay, of course we're going to have women in the military, but to integrate women into a standard infantry formation wasn't likely to work. I mean, it's basically like a nightmare Boy Scout camping trip that never ends. You're just marching around. Everyone's carrying like a 10-pound rifle, ammunition, camping gear. You're trudging along in formation and pitching tents and living out in the middle of nowhere for months on end. It's just hard to blend women into that in 1917. But the advent of the machine gun kind of created opportunity to make a new kind of military unit around the gun, because the gun is too big for one person to carry, so you have to break it up into about 4 parts. Each part is carried by a different member of the squad, And when they get there, they have to put the thing together and get it to work. And it's delicate, it's complicated, it's delicate, it's got to be kept clean. So it's more like a sewing machine than a bolt action rifle. And so there was kind of this thought of, well, women are great at operating sewing machines. And if you split the machine gun up into 4 parts, they can carry that, and it's a separate unit, so they don't have to live, next, cheek by jowl with the dudes in the infantry. So we'll have female machine gunners. So Dawn, or Aurora, the main character of the book, is exposed at an impressionable age to such a person, and it makes a huge impression on her, and kind of teaches her that she needs to look out for herself and be careful. And later on, she ends up in the United States, and it happens to be during the heyday of the Public Enemy era. So you've got Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and you've got, so the most famous of them all is Bonnie and Clyde. And there's this famous picture of Bonnie sitting on the fender of a getaway car, smoking a cigar and holding a Tommy gun. So these, all of these things kind of combine together in the mind of this character to give her a kind of fascination with high-powered automatic weapons that, that helps drive some of the plot of the book forward.
Noise of Knowing asks,
Okay.
Is the Enlightenment over? Another light question.
No, I think it's really deeply entrenched in everywhere. So it's ubiquitous, and to the point where people don't realize that a lot of what we do and think has emerged from Enlightenment thinking. There's kind of a parallel thing from Tom Holland, who's a historian, who talks about Christianity, and about the fact that even among people who do not in any way consider themselves to be Christian in the West, have all kinds of implicitly Christian reactions to things and beliefs about things. Yeah.
The environmental movement, which is constantly going after to regain the paradise, the Edenic paradise of the past, and
this is the wizard and the prophet.
Yeah, I guess I'm touting my own stuff, so I'll shut up.
No. I mean, it's your turn.
Yeah, no. So here's a complimentary question from Florin. Florin says, "I grew up in the Eastern Bloc. You have several characters with that background, very well written. What is your inspiration? What are your sources that enable you to understand that culture so well? In other words, why are you so great?"
Well, I mean, it's just reading books. I mean, that's really all there is. It's a pretty prosaic answer, but when I was a kid, like, I had a grandfather of a somewhat gloomy disposition who insisted I read the Gulag Archipelago. So, I got I think he just wanted to make the point that communism was bad, which, really landed. It's hard to elude that conclusion reading all 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago. So it's really just a matter of reading the available materials and trying to learn a little bit of history.
So Jay, I think, asks, basically, I'll quote, but he's basically asking you to talk about what's happening, coming next in this. How extensive will the bomb cycle series be, like the Baroque cycle? Yeah,
I mean, it should be comparable to the Baroque cycle. The Baroque cycle is basically 8 books as long as Polostan, and they're clumped together in 3 volumes. So I've got certainly 3 of those in mind, and I think it's fairly likely there'll be a 4th. And so I suspect it'll be shorter, but maybe of comparable heft or scope. I'm not sure how to explain it. But with the Baroque cycle, there was a lot of just describing things. Here's what this world looked like. And I think, again, we need a little bit less of that for a book that's set in the more recent past. I can say what an automobile is, and I don't have to explain that, for example.
I think in your Graphomane Substack, you said that each book would be centered on a single. So, who's the main character for Volume 2?
He's introduced at the very end of this. It's a British journalist who's sort of modeled after Peter Fleming.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the brother of.
He's one of my favorite writers.
Yeah, no, he's. So let's fanboy.
Yeah.
So Peter's the brother of Ian.
And a much, much better writer.
And everybody knows that. They go to the same school. And Ian's a complete fuck up. Peter is the golden boy. Everyone knows he's destined for greatness, that, Ian's just going to end up in a ditch. And he almost does, Ian. But Peter writes some of the finest kind of journalistic and sort of travel prose.
Right. Brazilian Adventure, one of the best books about Brazil ever written.
So explain the setup for Brazilian Adventure. Yeah.
So, do you guys know about the book The Lost City of Z? Yeah. So that was about what happened to Percy Fawcett and his attempt to retract. Well, Peter Fleming actually wrote that book 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I don't know. It's in the 50s or 40s. And he, unlike David Gran, actually went out there and he chronicles his total failure to find anything, and it's a complete catastrophe.
He just puts an ad in the paper.
Right? It's completely harebrained.
I'm going to Brazil. Anyone want to come?
and he has no idea what he's doing. But the amazing thing is, it's a wonderful book that is actually, you learn a lot about Brazil at the time.
Well, he's just got this wry, deadpan.
And so he's got this whole thing that he does where I'm a complete moron, traveling in these incredibly dangerous places and saved by luck time after time after time, which gives you some idea that maybe this is a bit of a persona, but it's a really good persona.
Yeah, he's got a great book about the Boxer Rebellion. I don't know if you've read that, but it's an incredible account of the Boxer Rebellion.
And so anyway, Peter Fleming, great. Most of his stuff is out of print, so you have to get it on, Abe Books and so forth. But they're just great.
There's a thing that those guys do really well that I don't know if we can do anymore, which is that he's writing for a pretty small circle of people who are highly, highly educated, clever English dudes.
He was a Times correspondent for the London Times.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of kind of witticisms and wry, humor that you can drop into your writing if that's who you're writing for, that will land with those people, but it doesn't necessarily work.
Right. And the other thing is that he feels, he's making fun of pretty much everyone, and so he can be pretty scathing. About people encounters.
The Boxer Rebellion book is not a highly sensitive document.
No, but stupidity is a much unappreciated factor in human life and history, and Peter Fleming is a real rich appreciator.
Yeah, and in his defense, of course, the bad guys in the Boxer Rebellion are the Chinese people who besieged the embassies.
Yeah.
But each national embassy, of all the different European countries and the Japanese, has its own set of fools.
Yeah.
Which he treats, with the sort of uniformly scathing contempt. It's great.
So David writes, what are a few things you learned about the period, which I think we're talking about Polostan, that are different from the standard interpretation, and how should that change our understanding?
One thing that changed between when I started it and when I kind of polished it off last year was understanding the famine in Ukraine, which happens to take place, during the time of this book. So, I had heard that there was a famine in Ukraine, but you read history, there's always famines, but
Another reason not to be nostalgic?
yeah. But along the way, I read Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine, which explains how this was a systematic, man-made famine imposed as an act of violence on Ukraine by Russia, and it's a completely horrifying, depressing book. There's lots of descriptions of the process of starving to death. To address the question, that's not me sort of cleverly discovering some little-known historical fact. That's just me bothering to read the book and learn what is horrifically obvious to people who live in that area. So no, I don't credit myself with having really learned anything or discovered anything new about this time. It's more just reading what's out there, and there's just all of this history that is so fascinating. All one needs to do is to kind of tell the story almost as it happened, and it can make for a really interesting story.
One of the things that struck me is you were saying that you don't have to explain what a car is, but do you kind of have to explain what the Soviet Union was? I mean, since it's been a long time since 1989. I'm not sure. My kids, who are pretty literate, sort of know about it,
Yeah.
but the kind of role that it occupied in the American imagination and the specter of communism. You know what I mean?
Well,
the
yeah.
whole
But it's interesting because at this time, this is 1933. It's pre-purges.
Right.
Right. It's pre. Stalin's in power, but and he's murdered millions of Ukrainians and gotten away with it because the Western sort of press that's in reporting from Moscow is either they don't bother to go learn the truth, or they're kind of willfully turning a blind eye to it. This point being that if you're just a reasonably well-read person back in the States or in the UK, you haven't yet formed the knowledge, the opinion of the Soviet Union that people would have decades later. And so there's still a lot of people flocking to the Soviet Union with idealistic notions of, we're going to help. They don't see the Soviet Union as an enemy yet. Mm-hmm. If you're a capitalist, you do see it as an enemy, but most people don't.
So Don's father is one of those people who goes to the Soviet Union to help out. And how many were there thousands of people like that? I actually don't remember.
I don't know the total number who went, but you're talking, these are people who went right after the revolution, so late teens, early 20s, to be part of what was happening.
Be part of history.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so a lot of them became disillusioned and went home. So Emma Goldman, writes really well about this era, what they found, how it clashed with their hopes, their dreams. The really scathing one is the book by Malcolm Muggeridge called Moscow in Winter. Mm-hmm. He's describing Western expats in Moscow with the same degree of absolutely scarifying contempt as Peter Fleming talking about the Belgian ambassador. So that's quite a read, if you want a picture of how that scene looked, at least to Muggeridge in that era.
Yeah, right. Langston Hughes also wrote a book on that.
Oh, did he?
He took a tour a little bit later than that and traveling through, and just the comparison between what he thought he saw and what we now know we saw. And so it's a wonderful book, but it's a complete fantasy.
Oh, okay. So he's, unlike Muggeridge, he's buying it. He
totally buys it.
Yeah,
pretty much, yeah. There's also these other forces. I mean, the left was a much more powerful, force in actually, throughout the developed world.
Yeah.
So you have the wobblies.
Yeah.
Is that going to play a role? These different threads or strains, or whatever the right word would be.
Yeah, there's a lot of wobbly content in this book. It's a name for the International Workers of the World, which was a comparatively intense labor union that it was a big deal in Seattle, which is kind of how I started learning about it. There was a big cultural split in the left between the Western United States and the Eastern, where the Eastern United States is immigrant factory workers taking their orders from Moscow. I'm grossly simplifying things here. And in the West, it's like miners of a heavily anarchic libertarian mindset, basically slugging it out with corporate thugs. So you get two very different approaches to labor relations out of those two kinds of people, and that becomes a kind of driving element in the story.
Yeah. No, I was a little surprised when Dawn Aurora is from Montana, but she, you move her back east. Yeah.
Yeah, her dad is more of the East, taking orders from Moscow. Her mom's a woman of the West. So
Will we see more of that?
I doubt it, because I'm trying to set up her story. Mm-hmm. From here, we kind of need to move on to what happens in the middle and late 30s, and so there's still a lot of, for example, there's going to be some Spanish Civil War stuff, but it's not so much about kind of labor in the United States.
So at various points, I hear from you that various people are interested in adapting your books for Hollywood. Is there actually anything to report on this front that is of interest, or you can talk about?
I mean, people take different approaches to talking about these things.
Right.
The active projects now, there's work being done on Snow Crash. There's work being done on Seven Eves, Diamond Age. I think those are kind of the biggies at the moment. We were pushing hard on Dodo for a while. We might try to revive that. You sort of don't announce anything until certain documents have been signed. And until then, it's easy to get into a lot of rumors, and you see this stuff all the time on the internet.
Right.
So and so is going to star in such and such movie, and then 5 years later you realize that never happened. So it's being worked. All of those are being worked on with various levels of intensity, but there's nothing I can really talk about. Definitely.
It seems like those people are very, very good at generating, cycles of activity.
When they want it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, yeah, thanks.